Hello, children. This is Grandma Carla with more of Freddy and the Perilous Adventure. Freddy, leaning over the edge of the basket, saw the crowd drop away beneath him. There was no feeling of going up into the air. It was as if the earth was falling away from the balloon. 1 minute, the fairgrounds were spread out beneath them, and then they shrank rapidly, slid away sidewise, and below was only a sort of colored map in which fields were no more than green and brown squares, and the barns and the houses red or white dots with roads like pieces of string connecting them. It was rather exciting, but not frightening at all. Up where there were in the air, the wind was stronger than it had been on the ground, and it carried them along swiftly. Emma had gotten down inside the basket, but Alice sat on the edge, hanging onto a rope with her bill. "Look, look, here comes the bean farm," she exclaimed, and sure enough, over the horizon came rolling the familiar fields and woods, with the tiny white house and the barns and the stable and the hen house, and that little speck you can hardly see is my home, thought Freddy. Oh, when will I enter it again? "Why, there's the duck pond, that little blue dot," said Alice. "Sister, come up here. You're missing everything." "I'm all right here," said Emma miserably. "Oh, come up. What would Uncle Wesley say to such talk?" "I'll hold on to you so you won't fall," said Freddy, who had at last gotten the better of the candy and found his voice. "Oh, dear. All right," said Emma faintly. And then, when they had got her up on the edge beside Alice, "Why, it's quite pleasant," she exclaimed delightedly. "Dear me, not at all alarming. I suppose that moving speck out in the hayfield is Mr. Bean. What time do you think we'll get home, Freddy?" "You may get home sooner than you expect to unless you stop talking and hang on to this rope," said Alice. "I think perhaps we ought to go down a little," said Freddy. "We're pretty high up, and we don't want to be carried too far." And he gave a short tug on the valve cord. But nothing happened. "That's funny," he said. "Mr. Gotcher said you didn't have to let much gas out if you wanted to come down." He gave 2 longer pulls, and then, as the balloon still kept on at the same level, he called, "Hey, Webb, come up here a minute." The spider came up over the edge of the basket and climbed up by Freddy's ear. "We've been riding in the bottom of this thing," he said. "My word, what of you?" Freddy exclaimed. He explained what was the matter. "I wish you'd climb up this cord," he said, "and see if that valve works." So Mr. Webb climbed up, and in a few minutes he climbed down again and reported that the valve cord had gotten tangled up in some of the ropes so that the valve could not be opened. "Guess there's nothing you can do," he said. "I'm not strong enough to fix it, and you're too heavy to climb up." "My goodness, do you see what that means?" said Freddy. "We can't get down." "She'll come down sometime," said the spider unconcernedly. "Anyway, you can always jump." No, I'm just fooling Freddy." "But what's the use of worrying?" "But suppose she comes down in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean?" "We're being blown away from the Atlantic Ocean at about 30 miles an hour, said Mr. Webb. "I'm hoping we'll be over Niagara Falls in the morning. Mother and I have always wanted to visit the falls." And he walked down to the end of Freddy's snout and dropped from it to the edge of the basket. "What's that you've got on your back?" asked the pig, for on the spider's shoulders, or at least the shoulders of his first pair of legs, was a little bunch of something gray that seemed to be fastened around him with strands of web. "Parachutes," said the spider. "Mother spun a couple of them for us to take along. Kind of foolish, I thought, but you know how women are." Said Freddy. "You and Mrs. Webb have parachutes, and Alice and Emma have wings, but what have I got?" "My goodness, you've got one of the finest views below you a pig has ever set eyes on. Why don't you enjoy it and stop worrying?" And the spider disappeared over the edge. The view was indeed impressive. Directly below them now was a good-sized lake set among rolling hills, wooded towards the tops, but laid out on the lower slopes and on the valleys in different colored shapes of cultivated land like a jigsaw puzzle. At the end of the lake was a tiny white village, and off in the distance to the northwest, a big city sprawled under a smoky haze. Syracuse, Freddy thought. He discovered suddenly that he was enjoying himself. He had only been scared because he thought he ought to be scared, but after all, he was having one of the most remarkable experiences of his long and colorful career. Of course, there was that speech he hadn't made. People were going to criticize him for that, but he could deliver a speech when he got back that could make them forget that unfortunate incident, or he wasn't Freddy. The balloon drove on westward. They were over Syracuse now. They could see strings of cars moving through the streets like ants, and an airplane came up and circled them twice and then flew away. Alice and Emma waved their wings excitedly at the pilot, who waved back. Syracuse rolled off down over the eastern horizon. "Next stop, Rochester," said Alice. "And the next one is Buffalo," said Freddy, and then he became thoughtful. For he had an idea that the next stop after that would be Lake Erie. And while it wasn't as big as the Atlantic Ocean, it wasn't a place he wanted to stop at a balloon trip. He wished he had brought his geography along. By and by, the sun began to go down. The shadows of the hills grew longer and longer, and they flowed together and darkened the roads and the fields and the villages, and finally covered them with a dark blanket, although the balloon, high up in the air, was still in the bright sunlight. Little lights pricked out here and there on the earth, some of them moving along the roads, others stationary in windows, and then the sun slid down out of sight. It got cool. Alice and Emma jumped down inside the basket. "I'm hungry," said Emma. "My goodness, I hope there's something to eat here," said Freddy. He rummaged about. "Cans," he said disgustedly. "Soup, beans, corned beef, can opener too. But what good is that?" For though he was very clever with his trotters and could run a typewriter and even write with a pencil, he could not hold a can opener with them. "Well, we've got that bag of candy anyway." So they ate candy for supper. They didn't talk much while they were eating it, but when they could open their jaws again, Freddy said, "It's going to be cold up here, and there's nothing more to see tonight, but we've got a blanket, and I vote we get under it and go to sleep." So they did. And Freddy was just dozing off when he felt a tickle in his ear, and Mr. Webb's voice said, "Getting kind of chilly for Mother out here, so I thought we'd crawl in with you, if it's all right." "Sure, sure," said the pig. "Only thing is, aren't you afraid you'll get squashed if I was to roll over in the night?" "Well, we'd rather not be squashed, and that's a fact," said Mr. Webb dryly. "But you've got good roomy ears, Freddy. Suppose we sleep in one of them. We'll be very quiet." "Yeah," said Freddy, "and suppose you get to thrashing around in your sleep. Suppose you fell down into my ear and couldn't get out. It makes me shudder to think of it. No, I'm sorry, but that's just out. Hold on, though. Ducks don't lie down when they're sleeping. They just stick their heads under their wings. Suppose you get in with them, under the other wing. Nice and snug and no danger. Real feather bed." So the Webbs fixed it up with Alice to get in under her wing, and then they all went to sleep. When they woke next morning, the balloon was drifting along over rough and heavily wooded country. There were no villages in sight, and only here and there in a clearing of a ramshackle house. They were much nearer the ground now because in the cool night the air in the gas in the balloon had condensed so that it wasn't as light as it would be later when the sun heated it up again. At least, that is how it was explained to Freddy later, though at the time he just thought that they had begun to come down. The basket wasn't more than 100 feet from the ground, though it might as well have been 1,000, Freddy thought, as far as getting out concerned. "It's funny," said Alice. "I wonder if we went over Buffalo in the night, and if we did, I suppose we're in Ohio." "Oh, it's too rough for Ohio," said Freddie. "And look, there's a mountain." "There aren't any mountains in Ohio. The geography says so." "Well, maybe the geography is wrong," said Emma. "Dear me, there's a mountain to prove it." "It's very odd," said Alice. "We were going towards the sun when it set last night, and now it's rising, and we're still going towards it." They puzzled over this for some time, until Emma said excitedly, "Why, we're going east. And that's because the wind has changed in the night. It's carrying us in the other direction." "Oh," said Freddie. "Oh, of course. Should have thought about that myself. I expect I would have in a minute, when I got waked up. What you'd better think about is when you get waked up is where we're going to get breakfast." "My goodness," said Freddie, and fell back against the side of the basket. For if there was anything he didn't like, it was going without his breakfast, or for that matter, any other meal that it happened to be time for, or even indeed anything to eat whether it was time or not. The world of the sky in which they were adventuring was a wonderful world, but if it was a world without food, it was no place for him. "We've got to get down," he said. "If we have to get down to get breakfast," said Alice, "I prefer to go without breakfast. I'm not hungry enough to jump." "There's only one piece of candy left," said Emma. So they decided to divide up the piece of candy, and when they had eaten that, they could think of what to do next. But it wasn't easy to divide up a piece of molasses candy if you haven't got a knife or scissors or anything. The ducks took the paper off, and then they each took hold of an end and pulled. Then they pulled and pulled, but all that happened was that the piece of candy got longer. They pulled it until it stretched from one end of the basket to the other, and then, of course, they couldn't go any further. They couldn't stop either because they had taken such a firm hold on it that they couldn't get their bills open again. So Freddie took hold in the middle, and then the ducks ate towards him, and pretty soon they were all sitting there with their noses together, trying to chew. And in that way, they ate up the last piece of candy. When they could talk again, Alice said, "Dear me, I wonder why it is that as soon as your jaws get stuck together, you think of so many important things to say." "I did too," said Freddie, "and now I can't remember any of them." "Uncle Wesley always used to say," quacked Emma, "that most of the things people thought of to say were better left unsaid. He said if you took all of the talk that went on in his farm during a year and squeezed it out, you wouldn't get more than 2 drops of sense." "As I remember your uncle," said Freddie. "He was quite a talker himself." "A very fine talker," said Emma. "He said many wise things." "Wise, eh?" said the pig. "You ought to collect them in a book. You could call it Wise Quacks. Uncle Wesley's Wise Quacks. Hey, that's not bad." But the ducks did not laugh, and Emma said primly, "I don't think Uncle Wesley would like that." Freddie tried to explain. "A duck quacks," he said. "So a duck's wise crack is a wise quack. I mean, it's a—" "Uncle Wesley did not approve of slang," interrupted Alice. "He said it was empty rattling of a brain too small for its skull. Were those not his words, sister?" "His very words," said Emma. "And quite right, too," said Freddie quickly. "Well, let's just drop the whole thing." He was getting a little tired of Uncle Wesley, whom he remembered as a stout and pompous little duck who had ruled his nieces with a rod of iron. Long after they had grown up, what Uncle Wesley said was their law, and they would no more have thought of doing anything of which he disapproved, or he disapproved, and he practically disapproved of everything, than they would have thought to become burglars. Freddie remembered something more about Uncle Wesley, too. For a band of the farm animals who were fond of Alice and Emma and sick of seeing them tyrannized over had kidnapped him one night and turned him over to an eagle who for a small consideration had agreed to drop him somewhere in the next county. Freddy had not had a hand in that plot, but with his great detective ability, he had of course found out about it. And while he didn't approve of such high-handed action, he didn't make any effort to get Uncle Wesley back. For after all, Alice and Emma would be much happier without him. But they admired him so intensely that even after his mysterious disappearance had freed them from his tyranny, they continued to quack his praises and to do as they thought he would approve. His fearlessness, his polished manners, his high moral standards, his deep wisdom, they praised these things daily. Freddy didn't believe that anybody, even a pig, could reach such a height of perfection. That is the end of chapter 3. So let's look at our pictures. Here is a picture of them all flying in the balloon, up into the air. And remember, Freddy said it looked like the earth was just slipping away. And here it says the view was indeed impressive. And there are the 2 ducks and Freddy looking over the side. And remember that Mr. and Mrs. Webb are along with them, but we can't see them very well in the picture because they're so tiny. And that is all of the pictures for chapter 3. And next time we will start chapter 4. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.